You don't belong here." Those were the exact words that pierced through the calm air the very first morning I set foot on my lakefront property. I had barely even shut the door of my pickup truck, still holding a heavy box of kitchen utensils in my hands, when I heard that shrill voice cutting across the driveway. I turned my head and saw her, Karen. The neighborhood's self-appointed ruler. Oversized sunglasses perched on her face, one hand on her hip, and the other clutching a thick clipboard like it was some kind of police badge. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't even say hello. She just strutted down the gravel path like she owned the place. She didn't waste a second. She pointed her pen at me like it was a weapon and barked, "All residents are required to join the Lakeview HOA. There's a $500 initiation fee, $250 monthly dues, and of course, you'll need to follow our rules: front yard maintenance, acceptable vehicles, lake access permits, and noise curfew. I'll need your signature today." I nearly dropped my box because I couldn't believe how fast she came at me. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Karen puffed out her chest. "Don't play dumb. Everybody here is part of the HOA. That includes you. If you don't join, you'll be fined immediately." Now here's the thing, this wasn't my first rodeo with HOAs. I'd seen power-hungry people like her before, trying to bully new residents into submission. But this time, I wasn't about to play along. I shifted the box to one arm, gave her the kind of smile that said, "Nice try," and replied, "Actually, no. When I bought this cabin, I specifically made sure it wasn't tied to any HOA. My property is free and clear. I don't owe you a dime." That smile of hers cracked instantly. Her jaw dropped like she'd just heard a blasphemy. She actually took off her sunglasses, squinted at me, and snapped, "That's not how it works. Everyone here has to be in the HOA. That's the law." I set the box down on my porch, dusted my hands off, and said flatly, "No, that's your rule. And your rules don't apply here." She gasped like I'd slapped her across the face. Then she scribbled furiously on her clipboard, mumbling about non-compliance and violations. I watched her stomp away down the road, heels crunching against the gravel, her phone already pressed against her ear. I knew right then, this wasn't over. 10 minutes later, I found out how far she was willing to go. A pair of flashing red and blue lights pulled into my driveway. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up, and 2 deputies stepped out, looking around like they'd been sent to investigate a hostage situation. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, shaking my head. Karen came running toward them like a child who'd finally tattled to the teacher. "Officers! Officers! That man is refusing to join the HOA. He's refusing to pay his dues. He's stealing from the community." The deputies froze, their brows furrowed, clearly trying to figure out why they had been called. One officer sighed and turned to her. "Ma'am, that's not a crime. HOA disputes are civil issues, not criminal ones." But Karen wasn't backing down. She jabbed her finger at me like I was some kind of fugitive. "He's refusing to comply. He has to be fined. He has to be removed from this neighborhood before he ruins everything." I calmly reached into my back pocket, pulled out my deed, and handed it over to the other deputy. "Here's the paperwork. This land is outside of her HOA jurisdiction. I specifically made sure of that when I bought it. She's got no legal authority over me." The deputy flipped through the documents, nodded, and handed them back. "Sir, you're correct. You're not obligated to join." Then he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, you can't call 911 for something like this. That's misuse of emergency services." Karen's face turned bright red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "No. That can't be true. Everyone is part of my HOA. Everyone has to follow my rules." The officer actually chuckled, shaking his head. Ma'am, listen carefully. You don't run this county. If his land isn't deeded into your HOA, you have no say over him. Period. Now unless there's a real emergency, we're leaving. Karen tried to block their way, throwing out threats about calling the board and filing lawsuits, but the deputies just brushed past her and got back into their cruiser. One of them gave me a sympathetic nod and said, "Good luck with that one," before they drove off. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe Karen had embarrassed herself enough to finally leave me alone. But oh, I was wrong. For her, this was only round one. She didn't just walk away that day, she stomped down the road like a queen who had been dethroned, promising revenge. And from that moment on, I knew my life on the lake was about to turn into a battlefield. What she didn't know, though, was that she had picked the absolute worst person to mess with. Because I had a secret, one she was going to find out the hard way. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of something being slapped against my front door. At first, I thought it might be the morning paper, but when I opened the door, I found a bright yellow piece of paper taped to the wood. In bold letters, it read, "Violation Notice, Unauthorized Vehicle. Fine, $200. I actually laughed out loud. There was my pickup truck, parked in my own driveway, and somehow Karen had declared it illegal. Down at the bottom, the notice said, "Payment must be made to Lakeview HOA within 7 days." I crumpled it up and tossed it straight into the trash. I figured, let her waste paper. But that was just the beginning. By noon, I caught her pacing back and forth in front of my house with that same clipboard, peering over my fence like a prison guard looking for escapees. When I stepped outside, she started scribbling again. "Your grass is too long." "That's another violation," she barked. I checked, it wasn't even half an inch above normal. "And your shutters don't match the community color scheme. That's a $300 fine." I had to bite back a laugh. My cabin wasn't even listed in their community guidelines, because I wasn't part of their HOA. But Karen? She didn't care about facts, she cared about control. A week went by, and suddenly my mailbox was flooded with envelopes stamped in big red letters, "Demand for payment." Each one was nastier than the last, threatening me with late fees, liens, and even foreclosure if I didn't comply. I ignored them all. But Karen wasn't satisfied. No, she had bigger plans. One afternoon, as I was unloading groceries, the mail carrier walked up looking annoyed. "Sir, you need to talk to your HOA president," he said, handing me a stack of letters. "She told me you weren't an authorized resident here. She tried to get me to stop delivering your mail altogether." I nearly dropped my milk right there on the driveway. "She said what?" The carrier nodded. "She insisted you were squatting in this cabin illegally. I told her that as long as your name's on the mailbox, I'm required to deliver, but I'm giving you a heads up, this lady's making trouble." That night, I sat on my porch and thought it through. Normally, I'd let petty people stew in their own nonsense, but this wasn't just annoyance anymore, she was actively trying to disrupt my life. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had an ace up my sleeve. See, what Karen and her board didn't know was that when I bought this property, I hadn't just bought my cabin. I had also purchased the land under the very roads, clubhouse, and lake access points her HOA depended on. Years ago, the original landowner struck a cheap lease agreement with the HOA, letting them manage the amenities while still paying rent for the privilege. When the land went up for sale, I scooped it up with the cabin. That meant that legally, I wasn't just their neighbor. I was their landlord. For weeks, I held on to that information, watching Karen escalate her attacks. She went from fake fines to flat-out harassment. One evening, I returned home to find a bright orange tow notice stuck to my truck. She had apparently called a towing company and claimed my vehicle was abandoned on community property. Thankfully, the company called me first before making a move, and when I explained that it was my driveway on my land, they backed off. But the fact that she had tried made my blood boil. The final straw came 2 weeks later when she showed up with 2 men in polo shirts carrying clipboards. They introduced themselves as the HOA's compliance officers and started snapping photos of my house. Karen crossed her arms and smirked. "We're documenting your violations. We'll be issuing a lien on your property this week." That was it. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. It was time to go on offense. I walked right up to them, calm as can be, and said, "You know, I've been patient. I've ignored your fake tickets, your lies to the post office, your harassment. But I think it's time we cleared something up once and for all. So, I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting. Tomorrow night. I expect you all there." Karen laughed in my face. "Finally. You're ready to admit you're part of the HOA." I didn't bother correcting her. I just gave her a grin that I knew would make her uneasy and went back inside. Because tomorrow night, I was going to flip her world upside down. When the board gathered the next evening in the clubhouse, I walked in holding a thick folder of documents. The room smelled of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, and everyone was seated around a long table like they were running a Fortune 500 company instead of a neighborhood club. Karen sat at the head, smug as ever, tapping her pen like she was about to sign my fate. "Well," she said sweetly, "we're glad you've finally come to your senses. Let's discuss your membership and fees." I didn't sit down. I didn't even waste time. I laid the folder right in the center of the table and opened it. Inside were property deeds, lease agreements, and renewal notices. Actually, I'm here to discuss something else. As of last month, your lease on this land expired. Which means that this clubhouse, your lake access, and your roads, they no longer belong to you. They belong to me. The room went dead silent. A couple of board members leaned in to read the documents. One of them gasped. Another whispered, "Oh my God, he's right." Karen's face twisted into disbelief. She laughed nervously, waving her hand. "This is ridiculous. The HOA owns everything here. You can't just show up with paperwork and pretend you're in charge." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Not pretend. Reality. You've been leasing this land for years. Your lease ran out. I bought it. That makes me your landlord. Which means, technically, you and your entire HOA are trespassing." The board members turned on her instantly. "You said we owned this land," one of them snapped. "You told us the HOA had full rights." Another shook his head, muttering, "You've been lying to us." Karen stammered, her confidence cracking. "And no, this can't be right. There must be a mistake. We can sue." I smiled. "You can try. But every page in that folder is signed and notarized. Good luck explaining to a judge why you've been trying to fine and harass the guy who actually owns the ground beneath your feet." That was the moment the smug queen of the neighborhood lost her crown. When I left that board meeting, I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. After all, I had laid everything on the table, showed them the legal documents, and watched Karen's smug little empire crack right in front of her face. Most people would have walked away after that, admitted defeat, and quietly licked their wounds. But not Karen. Oh no, she doubled down. And the weeks that followed turned into the most ridiculous battle I'd ever seen. It started small at first. She began spreading rumors around the neighborhood, telling anyone who'd listen that I was a fraud. According to her, my paperwork was fake, my deed was invalid, and I had tricked the county clerk into believing I owned the land. Some neighbors gave me side eyes at the mailbox, a few even avoided small talk, but the truth always finds its way out. Eventually, word spread that Karen had been lying for years about the HOA's supposed ownership of the land, and people started questioning her authority. But Karen wasn't about to lose control without a fight. One morning, I walked outside to find a giant red sign hammered into my front yard. It read in big block letters, "Property under HOA lien. Trespassers will be fined." I actually laughed so hard I had to sit down on my porch steps. She thought putting up a sign would somehow erase my ownership rights. So I grabbed my power drill, unscrewed the sign, and tossed it straight into the bed of my truck. Later that day, I drove over to the clubhouse, the same clubhouse sitting on my land now, and leaned the sign against the door with a note that said, "Nice try. Signed, your landlord." That must have burned her up, because the very next day, I woke up to find that someone had dumped a bucket of bright pink paint across my driveway. The message smeared across the gravel said, "HOA rules apply." My neighbors were out walking their dogs and saw me standing there, hands on my hips, staring at the mess. One of them, a quiet guy named Tom, shook his head and muttered, "Karen's really lost it." That was when I realized the tide was starting to turn. The community was beginning to see her for what she really was, a power-hungry tyrant who would go to insane lengths just to keep control. But the real escalation happened the following week when Karen tried to flex her so-called legal muscles. She filed a bogus lawsuit against me in small claims court, demanding thousands of dollars in unpaid dues and damages to the HOA's reputation. When the papers landed on my desk, I couldn't stop grinning. She had walked right into the trap. I showed up to court armed with every document, every deed, every lease contract proving my ownership. Karen strutted in with her clipboard like it was some kind of holy scripture, waving it around and shouting about rules and regulations. The judge listened for about 15 minutes before cutting her off. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you cannot sue someone for refusing to join a homeowners association they are not legally bound to. Furthermore, the defendant has provided evidence that your HOA no longer has any rights to the land in question. I suggest you and your board seek new legal counsel." The gavel came down, case dismissed. Karen's face turned crimson, and she stormed out of the courtroom like a child denied candy. I just walked out behind her, smiling, knowing the whole neighborhood would hear about her loss by sundown. But did that stop her? Of course not. She couldn't stand the idea of me being untouchable, of her rules no longer applying. So she switched tactics. Instead of fighting me directly, she started going after my tenants. See, after the lease expired, I began renting out access to the lake and clubhouse for events. Fishermen, campers, even families looking to host birthday parties were happy to pay me directly. It was a fair deal and everyone benefited. Except Karen, who suddenly realized her HOA was bleeding money. She began patrolling the lake like a guard dog, shouting at visitors and threatening to fine them if they didn't leave. One Saturday, I caught her marching down to the dock with her phone out, filming a group of kids who were fishing with their dad. She screamed at them, saying they were trespassing on private HOA property. I walked down calmly, stood between her and the family, and said, "Karen, you're the trespasser here. This dock belongs to me. These people paid me to be here. If you don't leave right now, I'll have you charged with harassment." She sputtered and waved her phone in my face. "You can't tell me what to do. This lake belongs to the HOA." I pulled a laminated copy of the deed from my pocket. Yes, I carried it with me by then, because I knew how she operated, and held it up to her camera. "Read it and weep. You're done here." The dad behind me chuckled and muttered, "Lady, you just got owned." Karen stormed off, but the damage was already done. The community had witnessed her meltdown, and more people started siding with me. Her final desperate attempt was the most outrageous of all. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw flashing lights coming down the road again. Another sheriff's cruiser parked in front of my cabin. I sighed, knowing exactly who was behind it. Sure enough, there was Karen, frantically waving her arms, claiming I was illegally profiting off HOA property by renting out the clubhouse. The deputies walked up, tired expressions on their faces, and asked for the paperwork. I showed them the deeds, the contracts, everything. They nodded, confirmed it was all legal, and then turned to Karen. "Ma'am," one of them said, "this is the second time you've misused emergency services to report something that isn't a crime. If you keep this up, you could face charges yourself." Karen's mouth dropped open. "You're threatening me?" "I'm the HOA president." The deputy actually laughed. "Not for long, I bet." Then they drove away, leaving her standing there humiliated. By this point, the board members were fed up. They held a special meeting without her, and word quickly spread that they were planning to dissolve the HOA altogether. Homeowners were tired of paying dues for nothing, tired of Karen's power trips, and tired of the endless drama. When the official vote came, the HOA collapsed overnight. Karen went from queen bee to just another neighbor with no power, no clipboard, and no control. As for me, I finally got the peace I wanted. I rented out the clubhouse as a lodge, started charging fair access fees for the lake, and invested the money back into making the place even better. Neighbors who once glared at me now waved and thanked me for kicking Karen off her throne. And Karen? Well, the last I heard, she packed up and moved out of town. Some say she tried to join another HOA in a different county, but word travels fast. Once people heard her reputation, no board wanted her anywhere near their neighborhood. For the first time in years, the lake was quiet again, free of her nonsense. And every time I sit out on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the water, I can't help but laugh. She called the cops on me, tried to find me, tried to destroy me, and in the end, she didn't even realize she'd been living under her landlord's rules all along. The downfall of Karen and her HOA should have been the grand finale, but the truth is, the last act of this saga was the sweetest. Because after the HOA collapsed, the community didn't just breathe a sigh of relief, they completely reinvented themselves. And I, the man who had been harassed, threatened, and nearly dragged into court by Karen, became the person they turned to for leadership. It was almost poetic. The same neighbors who once looked at me like I was some kind of rebel against their HOA now stopped by my porch to thank me. Some brought pies, others offered to help fix up the old clubhouse, and nearly everyone had a story about how Karen had made their lives miserable. The real surprise was just how deep her control had been. She wasn't just bossing people around with fake fines. She had been manipulating them with fear. One neighbor, an older woman named Marlene, confessed that Karen had once fined her $100 for having a wind chime that disturbed the uniform aesthetic. Another neighbor admitted Karen had banned his teenage son from fishing on the dock because children create too much noise. Someone else claimed Karen had even threatened to take away their right to use the lake if they didn't attend mandatory HOA meetings. Listening to all these stories, I realized that Karen hadn't just been annoying, she had been running a dictatorship. And the only reason it lasted so long was because people didn't know they had the right to say no. But with me holding the deeds to the land, they had a landlord who wasn't interested in controlling them, just in keeping the place running smoothly. I didn't want to fine people for grass length or tell them what color shutters they could have. I wanted the lake and community to thrive. So I decided to put together something new, not an HOA, but a simple community association, voluntary and free, where residents could meet, discuss improvements, and pitch in if they wanted to. No dues, no mandatory rules, no clipboard warriors. For the first time, people actually looked excited to participate. Of course, before any of that could settle, Karen tried one last desperate move. About a month after the HOA officially dissolved, I spotted her sneaking around near the old clubhouse late at night. I watched from my porch as she tried to jimmy the lock, probably hoping to get inside and take documents or sabotage something. I walked over quietly and flipped on my flashlight. She froze like a deer caught in headlights. "Karen," I said calmly, "you've got two choices. You leave now and never come back, or I call the sheriff and you finally get that trespassing charge you've been flirting with." Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but she knew I had her. She muttered something under her breath about me stealing her community, and then scurried off into the night. That was the last time I ever saw her near the lake. Within 2 weeks, her house had a for sale sign in the yard. She was gone. And the transformation that followed was incredible. Without Karen breathing down their necks, neighbors started planting gardens, repainting their homes in colors they actually liked, and hosting barbecues by the lake. The clubhouse, which I officially converted into a rental lodge, became the hub of activity. Weddings, birthday parties, fishing tournaments, you name it, people booked it. I even set aside certain weekends when the entire neighborhood could use it for free. That small gesture earned me more goodwill than anything else. People who had once whispered "outsider" now invited me into their homes for dinner. The tension that once hung over the community had completely lifted. Financially, it turned into a goldmine. Where the HOA had been bleeding residents dry with dues and fines, I made fair deals with event planners and outdoor groups who wanted access to the lake. The revenue I generated was more than enough to maintain the land, repair the docks, and keep the roads in good shape. And because I wasn't squeezing the residents, they actually trusted me. It was a win-win situation, and it made me realize how fragile power really is. Karen had clung to hers so desperately that she lost it all. By letting go of control and focusing on cooperation, I had gained far more than she ever did. The sheriff's deputies even came back one afternoon, this time off duty, just to check in. One of them chuckled as he leaned on the railing of the dock. "So, landlord of the lake now, huh? Can't say I've ever seen an HOA president go down in flames like that." I laughed and told him the whole story. They shook their heads in disbelief. "She called us twice trying to get you arrested," one said. "Now she's the one who practically got run out of town. That's karma." And honestly, it was. Because at the end of the day, Karen never understood the difference between authority and respect. She thought she could scare people into compliance, but respect isn't earned through threats. It's earned through fairness. Once people saw the difference, they never looked back. As the months rolled by, I got into a peaceful routine. Early mornings fishing on the lake, afternoons managing rental bookings for the lodge, evenings sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea while the sun dipped below the horizon. Every now and then, I'd chuckle to myself, remembering that first day when Karen had marched up with her sunglasses and clipboard, declaring that I had to join her HOA. She had no idea that she was barking orders at her own landlord. Neighbors still joke about it sometimes. At community cookouts, someone will inevitably bring it up. "Remember when Karen called the cops on her landlord?" And everyone bursts out laughing. It's become local legend. A cautionary tale about what happens when you push too far. The truth is, I never wanted a fight. I came to the lake for peace, for quiet mornings and beautiful sunsets. But when Karen tried to drag me into her world of fake fines and power trips, she ended up exposing just how hollow her little empire really was. And when the dust settled, I didn't just win, I built something better in its place. So now, when I sit back and watch the lake shimmer in the evening light, I feel a sense of satisfaction deeper than I can explain. Karen thought she could control me with her HOA. She thought she could bully me, fine me, even get me arrested. But in the end, all she did was hand me the keys to everything she thought she ruled. And the best part? Every single dock, every single road, every single inch of land she once bragged about controlling, it's mine. Not because I demanded it, not because I tricked anyone, but because I knew how to play the game she thought she owned. Karen wanted to be queen of the lake. Instead, she ended up just another tenant in my kingdom, paying the price for underestimating her landlord. That's the irony that never gets old. She called the cops on me for refusing to join her HOA, not knowing that I was the one person she could never push around. Because while she thought she was the ruler, she never realized she was living under my roof all along.